You tell yourself the fear is practical. You say it's about money, about stability, about safety, about healthcare, about distance from family, about language barriers, about the unknown. You frame it as responsibility. You call it realism. You tell yourself you're being mature. But if you sit quietly for a moment and allow the noise to settle, you may begin to notice that the fear is deeper than logistics. It's not really about visas or plane tickets or job markets. It's about identity. It's about who you believe you are allowed to become. When you imagine moving abroad, what you are really imagining is stepping outside the structure that has reinforced you your entire life. You are imagining walking away from the invisible system that has shaped your habits, your beliefs, your comfort zones, your relationships, and even your personality. That is not a small shift. That is a psychological rebirth. And rebirth feels like death before it feels like freedom. The real reason you're afraid to move abroad is because you sense that it will change you. Not slightly, not cosmetically, fundamentally. And even though part of you wants that expansion, another part of you is terrified of losing the familiar version of yourself. You have built your life in layers, your routines, your friendships, your work identity, your daily rhythms. They all reinforce a stable sense of who you are. When you wake up in the same city, drive the same roads, hear the same language, and interact with the same cultural cues, your nervous system feels anchored. You don't have to think about who you are, you simply perform it. That performance becomes automatic. Moving abroad disrupts that autopilot. Suddenly, no one knows your backstory. No one expects you to behave the way you always have. No one reinforces your old labels. You are no longer the reliable one, or the quiet one, or the ambitious one in the same way. You are just a human being in a new environment, responding moment by moment. That freedom is exhilarating, but it is also destabilizing. You are afraid because you understand, perhaps subconsciously, that you will not be the same person on the other side of that decision. And the ego resists anything that threatens its continuity. There is another layer to this fear that most people don't talk about. You are afraid of being seen as someone who left. In many cultures, staying is equated with loyalty and stability. Leaving can be interpreted as dissatisfaction or rejection. Even if no one explicitly says this to you, you may carry the weight of imagined judgment. You fear disappointing people. You fear being misunderstood. You fear being the one who chose a different path. But ask yourself honestly, are you living your life to avoid misunderstanding or to experience expansion? The fear also comes from uncertainty about your own capability. You may think you are confident, adaptable, and independent, but until you place yourself in a completely new environment, you don't truly test those qualities. Moving abroad removes the scaffolding. There are no shortcuts based on familiarity. You have to navigate differently. You have to listen more. You have to adapt more consciously. Part of you wonders, what if I'm not as capable as I think I am? But what if the opposite is true? What if you are far more capable than your current environment requires you to be? Sometimes you feel stuck not because you lack ability, but because you have outgrown the level of challenge around you. Your environment no longer stretches you in meaningful ways. It may exhaust you, but it does not expand you. There is a difference. Another deep reason you are afraid is because moving abroad forces you to confront the truth that your life is your responsibility. When you remain where you've always been, you can blame the system, the culture, the economy, the expectations. You can say, this is just how it is here. But when you choose to relocate, you are actively designing your life. You can no longer hide behind default settings. Designing your life is empowering, but it is also confronting. It requires clarity. It requires intention. It requires ownership. And ownership can feel heavy if you are not used to carrying it consciously. You may also fear regret. You imagine the worst-case scenarios. You imagine missing home, missing family events, missing familiarity. You imagine loneliness. You imagine confusion. You imagine making the wrong choice. But what you rarely imagine is the regret of staying, the slow erosion of curiosity, the quiet wondering of what might have happened if you had trusted yourself. Regret exists on both sides of every decision. The difference is that one form of regret is active and the other is passive. Active regret comes from trying and learning. Passive regret comes from never testing your edges. You are not truly afraid of moving abroad. You are afraid of stepping into a version of yourself that requires courage. Courage is not loud. It does not eliminate fear. It coexists with it. Courage says, I am willing to expand even though I cannot see the full picture yet. That willingness is what scares you, because once you admit that you are capable of change, you can no longer pretend you are stuck. There is also a neurological component to this fear. Your brain is designed to conserve energy. Familiar routines require less processing power. New environments demand attention, interpretation, adaptation. Your brain perceives novelty as potential threat until it learns otherwise. So the discomfort you feel when you imagine moving abroad is partially biological. It is your nervous system anticipating increased input. But increased input is also increased aliveness. Think about how you feel when you travel, even briefly. Your senses sharpen. You notice architecture, smells, language patterns, body language. Time feels textured. You are not half asleep in repetition. You are awake. That awakening is what your brain resists initially, but it is also what your soul craves. The fear you experience is a threshold. On one side is predictability. On the other side is expansion. Thresholds are uncomfortable because they require transition. They require letting go of one identity before fully inhabiting another. You are also afraid because moving abroad removes excuses. If you relocate and still feel dissatisfied, you will have to look inward more honestly. You will not be able to blame the environment in the same way. That accountability is intimidating, but it is also clarifying. Here is something important to understand. Fear is not evidence that you should not move. Fear is evidence that the decision matters to you. If you truly did not care, you would feel nothing. The intensity of your fear often matches the magnitude of the growth available to you. Major expansions trigger major resistance. Your mind will generate logical arguments to justify staying because staying preserves identity continuity. But logic can be selective. It rarely highlights the cost of stagnation. You are not required to move impulsively. You are not required to burn bridges. But you are required, if you want to grow, to question whether your fear is protective or limiting. Protective fear says, plan carefully. Limiting fear says, don't try at all. There is a difference. The real reason you are afraid to move abroad is that you sense the version of yourself on the other side. You sense that you will become more adaptable, more self-aware, more resilient, more open. And transformation always feels like instability before it feels like strength. You may also fear success. You may fear discovering that you thrive elsewhere. Because if you thrive elsewhere, you will have to accept that you had options all along. That realization can be humbling. But expansion is not betrayal. It is evolution. You are not abandoning your past by exploring your future. You are integrating it into a wider context. You carry your culture, your memories, your relationships within you. They do not disappear because you cross borders. What disappears is the illusion that there is only one acceptable way to live. The world is full of different rhythms, different definitions of success, different ways of structuring time and relationships. Exposure to those differences does not erase your identity, it enriches it. If you feel drawn to living abroad, that draw is not random. It is a response to internal growth. When your internal growth outpaces your external environment, friction appears. That friction can feel like anxiety, but sometimes it is simply expansion pressing against limitation. Instead of asking, why am I so afraid? Try asking, what version of myself is this fear protecting? Often, it is protecting the version that is comfortable but understretched. You do not have to conquer fear to move forward. You only have to be curious enough to explore despite it. Curiosity softens fear. It reframes the unknown as information rather than threat. The real reason you are afraid to move abroad is because it requires trust. Trust in your adaptability, trust in your decision-making, trust in your resilience, trust that you can create belonging instead of waiting to find it perfectly prepared. Trust feels risky because it is not guaranteed, but stagnation is not guaranteed safety either. If you never test your edges, you will never know the true dimensions of your capacity. The question is not whether you are afraid. The question is whether your fear is running your life. If something inside you keeps returning to the idea of living elsewhere, listen carefully. That repetition is meaningful. It is your mind exploring possibilities. It is your identity stretching. There is another layer of fear that hides underneath the obvious ones, and it rarely gets acknowledged. It is the fear of detachment from the narrative you have built about yourself. You have spent years telling yourself a story about who you are and what your life is supposed to look like. That story includes where you live, what you value, what success means, and what stability looks like. When you consider moving abroad, you are not just adjusting logistics. You are editing your story. And editing your story feels like stepping into uncertainty about your own coherence. Humans crave coherence. You want your past, present, and future to feel logically connected. When you contemplate relocation, especially internationally, it can feel like you are breaking the linear flow of your life. You may ask yourself, how does this fit? Will this make sense? Will I look scattered or unstable? These questions are not really about others. They are about your internal desire to feel continuous. But here is something important to understand. Growth rarely looks linear from the inside. Expansion often appears chaotic before it appears intentional. The most transformative decisions of your life rarely arrive neatly packaged in predictability. They arrive as invitations to trust yourself in unfamiliar territory. You are also afraid because relocation requires you to confront dependency in a new way. In your current environment, you may not even realize how many invisible supports you rely on. Familiar grocery stores, familiar systems, familiar social cues, familiar humor, familiar expectations. When you move abroad, those supports dissolve temporarily. You must build new anchors. That rebuilding process can feel like vulnerability, and vulnerability is uncomfortable because it strips away pretense. You cannot hide behind social fluency when you are learning a new language. You cannot rely on cultural shortcuts when you are decoding a new environment. You must be present. You must be humble. You must be patient with yourself. This humility is one of the greatest hidden gifts of living abroad. But before you experience it as a gift, you experience it as discomfort. The ego resists humility. It prefers competence. It prefers fluency. It prefers knowing. But imagine what happens when you allow yourself to not know. When you allow yourself to be the learner again. When you allow yourself to navigate slowly and consciously. You begin to see the world more clearly. You observe rather than assume. You respond rather than react. You become less rigid and more adaptable. That adaptability is not weakness, it is evolution. Another reason you are afraid is because relocation exposes how much of your identity has been externally validated. In your home country, your credentials, your status, your achievements may carry immediate recognition. Abroad, those signals may not translate in the same way. You may feel invisible at first, and invisibility can feel destabilizing. But invisibility can also be freeing. When external validation quiets down, internal validation must grow stronger. You start asking yourself deeper questions. Who am I when no one knows my resume? Who am I when my accomplishments are not the first thing people see? Who am I when I am simply a human being navigating a new place? These questions can be uncomfortable, but they are clarifying. They peel back layers of identity that may have been unconsciously shaped by social expectations. You are also afraid because moving abroad shifts your relationship to time. In many places, time moves differently. The urgency you may have internalized is not universal. When you step into cultures that prioritize presence over productivity, you may feel disoriented at first. You may not know how to relax without guilt. You may not know how to exist without striving. That disorientation is revealing. It shows you how deeply conditioned you are by your environment. It reveals the invisible narratives you have absorbed about worth and value. And when those narratives loosen, you must consciously choose new ones. Choosing new narratives requires courage because it means admitting that the old ones were not absolute truths. It means acknowledging that you have been shaped by context, and if context shaped you once, it can shape you again. That possibility is both empowering and unsettling. You may also fear that if you leave and discover a more aligned way of living, you will not want to return. This is a subtle but powerful fear. It is the fear of irreversible change. It is easier to fantasize about possibility than to confront it fully. Because once you taste a broader sense of freedom, once you experience life structured differently, you cannot unknow that experience. And knowing changes you. There is also grief hidden inside the fear. Even if you desire expansion, there is a part of you that knows leaving involves letting go. Letting go of daily proximity to certain people. Letting go of routines that once felt grounding. Letting go of familiarity that once felt comforting. Grief and excitement can coexist. They are not opposites. Allow yourself to acknowledge that duality. You can feel sadness and anticipation simultaneously. You can miss something before you even leave it. That does not mean you are making the wrong choice. It means you are emotionally aware. Fear often disguises itself as logic, but underneath it are layered emotions. Grief, vulnerability, humility, uncertainty, identity shift, narrative rewrite, exposure, accountability. When you name these layers, fear loses some of its mystery. It becomes understandable, and what is understandable becomes manageable. You do not need to eliminate fear to move forward. You need to understand it. You need to see that fear is not always a red light. Sometimes it is a signal that you are standing at the edge of transformation. The edge is uncomfortable because it separates the known from the possible. But staying permanently in the known can slowly shrink your world. Expansion requires stepping beyond reinforcement. It requires exposing yourself to different systems, different perspectives, different rhythms. It requires challenging the unconscious assumption that the way you have always lived is the way life must be lived. The real reason you are afraid to move abroad is that it demands maturity at a deeper level. Not the maturity of playing it safe, but the maturity of designing your own experience consciously. It asks you to stop waiting for perfect conditions and start engaging with possibility. And that engagement reshapes you. When you choose expansion, you do not become reckless. You become aware. You begin observing where you feel alive and where you feel diminished. You start distinguishing between comfort that nourishes and comfort that numbs. That distinction is powerful, because once you recognize numbness, you cannot pretend it is fulfillment. And once you recognize potential, you cannot convincingly argue that you have no options. Fear may try to convince you that expansion equals chaos, but expansion, when approached intentionally, equals growth. Growth stretches you. It exposes weaknesses and strengthens capacity. It refines your resilience. It deepens your self-trust. You begin to realize that the world is not something to fear. It is something to engage with thoughtfully. When you step into new environments, you also step into new reflections of yourself. Different cultures highlight different traits. In one place, you may feel overly intense. In another, you may feel appropriately driven. In one place, you may feel isolated. In another, naturally connected. In one place, you may feel rushed. In another, regulated. Environment interacts with identity. and identity evolves through interaction. If you remain in a single context forever, you only see one reflection of yourself. If you expand your context, you discover additional reflections. That discovery is worth discomfort. Before this line, allow yourself to pause and consider this. What if the fear you feel is not a barrier, but a threshold? What if it is not protecting you from harm, but protecting you from transformation? And what if transformation is precisely what you have been craving beneath the surface of your daily life? You are not weak for feeling fear. You are human, but you are also capable of expansion. If you want clarity instead of endless internal debate, that is where understanding your alignment becomes important. The World Match app helps you explore which countries and regions align with your values, lifestyle preferences, pace, and mindset. Instead of guessing or romanticizing random destinations, you gain grounded insight into where people like you tend to thrive. You can take the quiz now at worldmatch.app and begin turning abstract fear into informed curiosity. Sometimes fear is not telling you to stop. Sometimes it is telling you that you are standing at the edge of something larger than you have allowed yourself to experience. And the only way to discover what is on the other side is to step forward. Not because you are fearless, but because you are ready to expand.